Just 30 minutes before the most important meeting of his career, a millionaire receives a devastating call. The translator specialized in Japanese had an accident and will not attend. Without knowing a single word of the language, he's about to lose a 700 million real contract with the country's most powerful Japanese businesswoman. In absolute despair, he tries to use translation apps, but the technical terms come out completely distorted, causing expressions of confusion among the Japanese visitors. That's when the cleaner's 8-year-old daughter, who usually plays in the hallways during school vacations, timidly approached and whispered something that left everyone in shock. The air in the 37th floor conference room was thin, expensive, and heavy with the tension of $700 million. Arthur Blackwood felt every molecule of that air pressing on his chest, a sensation he, a man accustomed to commanding his own universe, detested with every fiber of his being. The glass walls revealed a city that stretched out at his feet, a kingdom he had built with shrewdness, risk, and a calculated ruthlessness. His fortune was legendary, a portfolio diversified in stocks, real estate, and even a speculative foray into cryptocurrency that had yielded an obscene profit. But now, all of it felt fragile, a house of cards about to be blown over by a breeze from the other side of the world. 40 minutes remained until the arrival of the Japanese delegation, and the silence in his office was more deafening than any fire alarm. His fingers drummed on the polished mahogany table, a gesture of impatience that barely contained the panic simmering beneath his controlled facade. This contract wasn't just about more money, it was about survival. A disastrous investment in clean energy technology had blown a hole in his capital, and the interest on the accumulating debt threatened to sink his empire. His phone buzzed, cutting the silence like a knife. It was Claire, his assistant. "Mr. Blackwood, I have terrible news." Her voice was shaky, and Arthur felt his stomach churn. He hated weakness, and Claire's voice was the epitome of it. "It's Mr. Ishikawa. His wife went into premature labor. He's on his way to the hospital. He can't make it." Arthur closed his eyes. Ishikawa was more than a translator. He was the best corporate Japanese interpreter in the country, the only one who understood the cultural nuances that could make or break a deal of this magnitude. "Fix it, Claire," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care how. Find someone else. Now." The click of the phone ending the call was sharp, final. He stood up, walking to the window, his hands in the pockets of his Italian suit. The city below seemed to mock him. So many assets, so much wealth, and his future depended on a single person who was now in a maternity ward. The humiliation was palpable. Minutes that felt like hours dragged by. Claire entered the room, her face pale. "Sir, I've called every agency. There's no one. The few available don't have experience with the technical vocabulary. It would be a disaster." The panic, cold and sticky, finally breached his armor. He turned to her, his face a mask of contained fury. "Useless! You're useless!" His words were like lashes. It was then that a subtle movement near the door caught his attention. A small girl, about 8 years old, with large, dark eyes and black hair tied back in a ponytail, was standing there, holding a small dust cloth. It was the cleaner's daughter, Emiko, a quiet, efficient Japanese woman he barely noticed. The child watched him with a serene curiosity, unafraid. "What are you doing here? Get out!" he ordered, contempt thick in his voice. "This is no place for children. Go help your mother clean the bathrooms." The girl didn't move for a moment, her eyes fixed on his, as if processing not just his words, but the storm of desperation behind them. Then she turned and left silently, leaving him alone with his impending disaster. He didn't give her another thought. What did a cleaner's daughter matter when his business empire was about to crumble? He glanced at the clock. 20 minutes. 20 minutes until the end. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Blackwood." Claire's voice trembled again. "Ms." Tanaka's delegation has just arrived at the building. They're on their way up. The double glass doors hissed open, and Arthur Blackwood's world shrank to the size of that room. Ms. Tanaka was the personification of elegance and contained power, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, her black hair in a perfect bun. She exuded a serene authority that made Arthur's ostentation feel vulgar in comparison. Beside her, 3 men, all with the same impassive expression, performed a synchronized bow. Arthur, in his rising panic, just gave a short nod, a cultural blunder he felt in the air like an electric shock. Ms. Tanaka said something in a melodic flow of Japanese, and her aides looked at Arthur, waiting. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, breaking into a cold sweat. He gestured toward the chairs. "Please, have a seat." The words came out louder than he intended. The delegation remained standing, confusion subtly creasing their brows. The disaster was happening in slow motion. Desperate, Arthur grabbed his phone, the state-of-the-art device feeling like a useless brick in his hands. He opened a translation app, typing frantically. "It is an honor to receive you. I hope we can finalize our agreement today." He hit the audio button. A robotic, metallic voice echoed in the room, butchering the pronunciation and syntax. The literal translation sounded like a technical insult. Miss Tanaka maintained her composure, but one of her aides exchanged a quick glance with another, an unmistakable sign of disaster. Arthur felt his face burn. He, the multi-millionaire who controlled boards and crushed competitors with a single call, was reduced to a babbling fool, dependent on faulty technology. He was about to try again to talk about the investment and profit potential when the door creaked open. It was Emiko, the cleaner, her face contorted in panic and shame. She bowed so low her forehead almost touched her knees, muttering apologies in Japanese as she tried to pull her daughter, who was peeking from behind her, back into the hallway. "So sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered in heavily accented English, but the girl, Yumi, slipped from her mother's grasp. With a calm that contrasted violently with Arthur's internal chaos, she walked into the room. Before he could shout for her to get out again, she walked to the center of the Persian rug, stopped a respectful distance from the delegation, and performed a perfect bow, arms straight at her sides, back straight, head lowered. The gesture was so precise, so laden with respect, that a stunned silence fell over the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she spoke. The Japanese words flowed from her, not like a child reciting a memorized phrase, but like a seasoned diplomat. The sound was complex, formal, and unquestionably authentic. Arthur didn't understand a word, but he saw the transformation. Ms. Tanaka's tense jaw relaxed. The mask of impenetrable politeness dissolved, and for the first time since she had entered the room, a genuine, warm smile lit up her face. She replied to the girl in a soft, encouraging tone, inclining her head slightly. The other members of the delegation looked at the child with astonishment and admiration. Yumi replied again, a short, respectful phrase. The ice hadn't just been broken, it had completely melted. Arthur stood frozen, his phone still in his hand, his mouth half open. The salvation of his empire, of his entire net worth, was happening right in front of him, orchestrated by an 8-year-old girl he had humiliated and sent to clean bathrooms just moments before. Time seemed to warp inside the room. Arthur Blackwood, a man who built his fortune on split-second decisions on the stock market, was completely paralyzed. His mind, a finely tuned mechanism for calculating risk, profit and loss, simply couldn't process the scene. The Japanese delegation, once a wall of icy formality, was now seated, smiling at little Yumi, who remained standing, a beacon of calm in Arthur's storm. Claire, his assistant, looked from the girl to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pleading. This was his chance, his only chance. Swallowing the bitter lump of pride in his throat, he made a subtle gesture with his hand, an invitation for the girl to stay. The relief on Claire's face was immediate. Yumi's mother, Emiko, still hovered at the door, looking as if she wished the floor would swallow her whole. But the look of gratitude she shot Arthur was so profound that he had to look away, uncomfortable. The meeting, somehow, restarted. Arthur pulled up his presentation, the script carefully crafted to maximize perceived value and ensure a robust return on investment. He began to speak, his voice strained, simplifying his language, treating complex business concepts as if he were explaining them to a child. Our projected cash flow for the first quarter is... He paused, waiting for the translation. Yumi listened intently, her head tilted slightly. Then, she turned to Ms. Tanaka and spoke. What came from her mouth was not a literal, childish translation. It was technical terminology, complex phrases about working capital and profitability delivered with a fluency that Ishikawa, his official interpreter, would have envied. The Japanese delegation nodded, one of them making a note in a pad. Arthur gaped. How? How could an 8-year-old girl understand and translate with such precision? The meeting proceeded at this surreal pace. Arthur presented his slides, filled with charts on dividends and asset appreciation, and Yumi, the small, unlikely messenger, built the bridge between two empires. At one point, Arthur used an aggressive metaphor about capturing the market. Yumi paused for a second, then translated the idea using an analogy about harmonizing with the market's needs, a cultural nuance Arthur would never have conceived of, and one that drew smiles of approval from the executives. The tension in the room had dissipated, replaced by a hum of productivity and mutual respect. Just as Arthur began to feel a sliver of hope, the door opened again. It was Richard Wallace, his vice president. Richard was a man with the ambition of a shark and the patience of a spider. He walked in with a polished smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. Upon seeing the scene, Arthur depending on the cleaner's daughter, his smile faltered, replaced by a look of pure disdain. He sat down next to Arthur, the scent of his expensive cologne an affront to the delicate moment. The first part of the presentation concluded. Ms. Tanaka suggested a short break, and the delegation retreated to an adjacent room. As soon as the door closed, Richard leaned in close to Arthur, his voice a venomous hiss. "Arthur, what the hell is this? A puppet show? The future of our entire portfolio, our stock value, is on the line, and you're trusting a child. I just got a call from a board member. He saw the girl come in with her mother through the service entrance. People are already talking." Richard's words were like acid, eating away at the thin layer of hope Arthur had begun to feel. People are already talking. The phrase echoed in his mind. His reputation, the image of control and infallibility he had so carefully cultivated, was being tarnished. The thought of other executives, his rivals, his subordinates whispering about his reliance on a child was an unbearable humiliation. "She's doing the job, Richard," Arthur shot back, his voice lower and less confident than he would have liked. "She understands nuances even Ishikawa missed." Richard let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Nuances? Arthur, we're talking about a $700 million deal, not a kindergarten class. You're risking everything on a whim. The company isn't just yours, remember. We have shareholders. The news that we're using child labor, let alone the daughter of an immigrant, to close a $1 billion deal will destroy us before the ink on the contract is even dry." The veiled threat was clear. Richard wasn't just concerned. He was building a case against Arthur, planting the seeds of doubt that could blossom into a boardroom rebellion. Across the room, Emiko quietly straightened the coffee tray, trying to make herself invisible. Her shoulders were slumped as if the weight of Richard's words was falling directly on her. Yumi stood beside her, quiet, but her dark eyes watched the exchange between the two men with an intelligence that belied her age. She understood more than just the languages. The Japanese delegation returned, and the meeting resumed. But something had changed. Richard's presence in the room was like a subtle poison in the air. He would interrupt, trying to use his own rudimentary business school Japanese, and each time he did, Ms. Tanaka's expression would close off a little more. Yumi, sensing the growing tension, would correct Richard with surprising gentleness and diplomacy. "With all due respect, Mr. Wallace," she said at one point in perfect English, "the word you used could be interpreted as a demand, whereas Ms. Tanaka suggested a collaboration." The look Richard shot the girl was glacial. The humiliation of being corrected by a child in front of such a major client was a direct blow to his ego. Richard's campaign of sabotage wasn't limited to the room. During the next break, Arthur saw him in the hallway, speaking in low tones to another director, gesturing back toward the conference room. The rumors were spreading like wildfire. When Arthur returned to the room, his phone buzzed with a text from a board member. "What's going on in there? Heard you hired the janitor's kid. Is this some kind of joke?" Rage and desperation warred within Arthur. He was trapped. He needed Yumi to save the contract, but using her was costing him the respect and trust of his own team. He looked at the girl. She was sitting in a corner, reading one of the company's brochures, her face serious and focused. She wasn't a whim. She was the only thing that was working in this chaotic day, but Richard wouldn't give up. He was a predator who had smelled blood in the water. If the deal failed, the blame would fall squarely on Arthur and his irresponsible decision. If the deal succeeded, Richard would find a way to claim the credit, or worse, use the situation to undermine Arthur's authority permanently. What Arthur didn't know was that Richard's campaign had already gone far beyond simple hallway gossip. He had asked one of his subordinates to run a discreet check, a check on Emiko, Yumi's mother, and he had just received the information he needed, the perfect weapon to destroy Arthur and seize control. The week that followed that first meeting was an exercise in prolonged torture for Arthur. Ms. Tanaka, clearly impressed by Yumi's skill, proposed a series of technical follow-ups to hash out the contract details, subtly insisting on the presence of the young interpreter. Each day, Arthur was forced to swallow his pride and depend on the child he had barely noticed before. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the firm grew increasingly toxic. Richard Wallace orchestrated his campaign with surgical precision. Whispers in the hallways turned into open conversations. "Did you see the boss brought his mascot in again? Wonder if she gets a lollipop for every million she translates." The humiliation was constant, a slow-acting poison that eroded Arthur's authority. He saw it in the eyes of his executives, a mixture of pity and contempt. The man who had built a business empire, whose fortune was the subject of magazine features, was now seen as an eccentric, entrusting the future of thousands of jobs to a child. The pressure was affecting his judgment. He became short-tempered and impatient, which only fed Richard's narrative that he was losing his grip. On a Tuesday afternoon, the first significant obstacle materialized. Richard walked into Arthur's office without knocking, his face a mask of false concern. He tossed a folder onto the mahogany desk. "We have a problem, Arthur. A big one." Arthur opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents, an expired work visa, and an application for renewal that appeared to be stalled in government bureaucracy. "The documents belong to Emiko, your little translator's mother," Richard said, his voice dripping with venom. "She's out of status. Technically, she shouldn't even be working here. If this gets out, and it will, we'll be investigated for employing undocumented immigrants. The fines are in the millions, not to mention the scandal." Arthur's blood ran cold. It was the perfect weapon. Richard had him cornered. "What do you want, Richard?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse. Richard's smile was predatory. "I want what's best for the company. I want you to get rid of the girl and her mother, immediately. I'll take over the negotiations. I've hired a team of professional translators from a top-tier agency. They start tomorrow." It was blatant blackmail. Richard was using the vulnerability of a single mother to seize power. "And if I don't," Arthur asked, though he already knew the answer. Then I will be forced, as vice president and a member of the board, to take action. An anonymous tip to immigration. Think of the scandal, Arthur. The media would eat us alive. Billionaire exploits undocumented immigrant family to close deal. The Japanese contract would be the least of our worries. Our entire net worth could evaporate in days. Arthur felt himself suffocating. Protecting Emiko and Yumi meant risking the destruction of everything he had built. Caving to Richard meant handing his empire to the man he despised most, and worse, abandoning the one person who was genuinely helping him. Late that afternoon, he called Emiko to his office. The woman entered, bowing, her eyes filled with apprehension. He didn't know how to begin, how to tell her that her presence and her daughter's, his salvation, had become his greatest liability. "Emiko," he started, his voice failing him. "We need to talk about your documentation." The terror that flooded the woman's eyes was something Arthur Blackwood, in all his life of merciless business dealings, would never forget. The terror in Emiko's eyes was a mirror of Arthur's own panic. He, who had always seen himself as a master of the universe, a predator at the top of the corporate food chain, was now complicit in an act of unspeakable cruelty. He explained the situation as gently as he could, omitting Richard's direct blackmail and framing it as a concern for the company's legal compliance. But the words sounded hollow and hypocritical even to his own ears. Emiko listened in silence, her body rigid, her hands twisting the fabric of her uniform. When he finished, she simply nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yumi and I will no longer be a problem." Her quiet dignity was sharper than any accusation. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't argue. She just accepted her fate with a resignation that shamed him to his core. She stood, gave a small bow, and walked out of his office, leaving behind a silence that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Arthur felt like the lowest creature on earth. He had used a child's extraordinary talent, and at the first sign of trouble, was casting her and her mother aside to save his own skin. The decision ate at his soul, but the fear of losing his empire, his fortune built over decades, was stronger. The next day, Richard took charge. He strode into the conference room with triumphant arrogance, followed by two starched-looking translators carrying leather briefcases. The Japanese delegation arrived, and Ms. Tanaka's eyes immediately scanned the room for Yumi. When she saw only the new faces, a flicker of disappointment crossed her features, quickly replaced by her professional mask. The meeting began, and the disaster was immediate and spectacular. The first translator, a middle-aged man with a heavy accent, rendered a proposal about market synergy as market invasion. The Japanese team stiffened. The second translator, attempting to correct the error, used an overly casual form of address that was considered an insult in a formal business setting. The atmosphere in the room, which Yumi had warmed with her grace and intelligence, turned glacial again. Richard, realizing he was losing control, began to sweat. He tried to interject, but his limited Japanese only made things worse, creating more confusion and misunderstanding. Miss Tanaka, with cutting politeness, interrupted the meeting mid-sentence. She said something in Japanese to her team, and they all stood. One of the new translators, stammering, tried to explain. She says there has been a fundamental misunderstanding of our corporate values, and she would like to reconsider the partnership. They gave a formal bow and walked out of the room, leaving Richard standing, mouth agape, in the wreckage of his attempted coup. The $700 million contract was slipping through their fingers, not because of numbers or projections, but because of a collapse in communication and respect. Arthur, who had been watching from his office through the glass walls, felt a chill run down his spine. He had given in to blackmail, betrayed the one person who could have saved him, and was now about to lose everything anyway. The phone on his desk rang. It was Claire. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "It's Ms. Tanaka. She's on the line and insists on speaking with you, and she asked me to ask, where is the little girl Yumi?" Ms. Tanaka's question, "Where is the little girl Yumi?" shot through the phone line and hit Arthur like a physical blow. It wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a demand, a statement. In that instant, Arthur understood something fundamental. To Mrs. Tanaka, Yumi wasn't just a translator. She was a symbol of the integrity, authenticity, and respect she expected in a business partner. The girl's absence was more than a logistical inconvenience. It was a breach of trust. Panic gave way to a cold, sharp clarity. He had played Richard's game and lost spectacularly. Now, there was only one path forward, however risky and humiliating it might be. "Claire," he said, his voice firm for the first time in days, "tell Ms. Tanaka that I apologize for the misunderstanding. Tell her that the girl, Yumi, and her mother were dismissed due to an internal administrative issue that I, personally, am resolving. Ask her, as a personal favor, to grant us 24 hours. He hung up before Claire could reply. The time for weakness was over. He stood. The decision solidified in every fiber of his being. He wasn't just going to fix the damage, he was going to burn the rot out of his own company. He walked to Richard's office. The vice president was on the phone, likely trying to do damage control with the board, blaming the incompetent translators. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply pointed to the door. Richard looked at him, first with confusion, then with a defiant glint. "Arthur, don't be ridiculous." "Out!" Arthur interrupted, his voice low and lethal. "Clear out your desk. You're fired." The shock on Richard's face was immense, followed by an arrogant fury. "You can't do this. The board will hear from me how you sabotaged a $700 million contract and blackmailed your CEO," Arthur retorted. "Now, get out of my building." Security was called, and Richard Wallace was escorted from the building, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box. An ignominious end to his career. That was the easy part. The next would be the hardest. Arthur grabbed his coat and went down to the ground floor. He didn't know where Emiko and Yumi lived. He had never cared enough to know. He went to the Human Resources Department, where a nervous clerk, intimidated by his presence, took several minutes to find the address in an old file. It was in a modest neighborhood on the other side of the city, a world away from his luxury penthouse. Driving through streets he'd never seen, Arthur felt the weight of his actions. He was no longer just a businessman trying to save a deal. He was a man seeking redemption. He found the apartment building, a simple red brick structure. He walked up 3 flights of stairs that smelled of disinfectant and home cooking. He stopped in front of apartment 3B and hesitated. What would he say? How could he ask for help from those he had betrayed? He took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened a crack, and Emiko's face appeared, etched with worry and exhaustion. When she saw him, her eyes widened in shock and fear. Behind her, he could see Yumi, who looked at him not with anger, but with a sad, piercing curiosity. "Miss Sato," he began, the name feeling foreign and formal in his own mouth. I've made a terrible mistake. I need your help. I need Yumi's help." He was standing there. Arthur Blackwood, the billionaire, the titan of industry, on a cleaner's doormat, begging. And, to his horror, from inside the small apartment, he heard the unmistakable sound of an approaching siren, stopping right in front of the building. The siren wailed outside, a sharp, predatory sound that cut through the stagnant air of the hallway. The fear on Emiko's face turned to pure panic. She tried to slam the door, a mother's protective instinct, but Arthur, acting on an impulse he didn't understand, put his hand out to stop her. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "Don't." Loud, official knocking pounded on the door, making it shudder in its frame. "Immigration, open the door." The voice was impersonal, bureaucratic, and filled with a menacing authority. Arthur's world spun. Richard, even after being fired, the anonymous tip had already been made. The gears of the bureaucratic machine were already in motion, and he, Arthur, had set them turning by caving to the blackmail. He was responsible. Yumi, who had been watching silently, stepped forward and took her mother's hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes showed not fear, but a grim resolve. "Oka-san, Daijubu," she said in Japanese, her voice firm. Emiko, trembling, opened the door. Two uniformed agents, a man and a woman, stepped into the small apartment. Their eyes swept over the simple furniture and landed on Emiko and Yumi, then on Arthur, with a flicker of surprise. "Emiko Sato?" the male agent asked, reading from a clipboard. Emiko just nodded, unable to speak. "We received a tip regarding your visa status. We'll need you to come with us for questioning." The word questioning sounded like a sentence. Arthur felt a surge of rage and guilt. He stepped between the agents and the family. "There's been a mistake," he said, his command voice returning with full force. "I'm Arthur Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Corp. Ms. Sato is an essential employee for an ongoing international negotiation. Her documentation is being expedited by my attorneys." The agent raised an eyebrow. Skeptical. "That's not what our system says, Mr. Blackwood. Unless you have a court order, we'll have to follow protocol." In that moment, the depth of the chasm he had dug for himself became clear. His money, his fortune, his influence. None of it mattered against the cold mechanics of the law, a law he, through cowardice, had allowed to be weaponized. He looked at Yumi. The girl was watching him, not with the hope that he would save her, but with a kind of assessment, as if she were measuring his character, weighing his actions. It was then that a subplot, a thread of history he was unaware of, began to reveal itself. Yumi turned to her mother and said something in Japanese, a quick, reassuring whisper. Emiko, still terrified, answered, and in their exchange, Arthur heard a name, Obachan. Grandmother Yumi then addressed the agent in perfect, polished English. "Excuse me, sir. My mother doesn't fully understand the process. Could you explain the procedures so I may translate for her?" The agent, taken aback by the child's eloquence, hesitated. "Well, miss, my grandmother," Yumi continued, her voice calm and clear, "was descended from Japanese immigrants in Brazil. She taught me that in difficult situations, clarity and respect for procedure are the best paths. She also taught me about giri and on, the obligations and debts of gratitude. Mr. Blackwood has a debt to us, and we have an obligation to see this through." Arthur was stunned. The girl wasn't just talking, she was negotiating, using deep cultural concepts to reframe a situation of fear into a matter of honor and procedure. She wasn't asking for mercy, she was demanding respect. That knowledge didn't come from books, it was lived, breathed, passed down through generations. Her grandmother had taught her not just the language, but the soul behind it. Yumi's intervention changed the dynamic in the room. The immigration agents, used to dealing with fear and confusion, were disarmed by the girl's serenity and intelligence. They looked from Yumi to Arthur, the situation suddenly more complex than a simple visa check. Arthur seized the opening. He took out his phone and made the most important call of his career, not to a stockbroker or a banker, but to Marcus Thorne, the most expensive and ruthless lawyer in the city. "Marcus," Arthur said, without preamble, "drop everything you're doing. I need you at the address I'm sending. Now, it's an immigration emergency. Spare no expense. Don't take no for an answer. Stop a deportation." The mention of Arthur Blackwood's name and the urgency in his voice made the agents pause. They knew this had just escalated from a routine matter to a potential legal battlefield with a billionaire. They agreed to wait for the lawyer's arrival, but the threat still hung in the air. As they waited, the small apartment became a stage for contained emotions. Emiko made tea, a gesture of hospitality that was almost surreal under the circumstances. Arthur accepted a cup, his hands trembling slightly. Sitting on the modest sofa, surrounded by family photos and small Japanese decorations, he felt like an intruder, the architect of this catastrophe. It was during this tense interlude that Ms. Tanaka called back. Claire patched her through to Arthur's cell. "Mr. Blackwood," her voice was cold as steel, "I have received some disturbing news through my contacts. I've been informed that the young interpreter's family is being targeted by authorities because of their involvement in our negotiation. Is this true?" The question was not a question. It was an accusation. The second, more formidable obstacle had risen. In Japanese culture, gratitude is a social pillar. Ingratitude, especially towards someone who has provided crucial help, is a grave offense. A stain on one's character that makes any business partnership impossible. "Miss Tanaka," Arthur began, his throat dry, "the situation is complex. There was internal sabotage at my company. A disloyal executive acted behind my back." He knew it sounded like a flimsy excuse. "Mr. Blackwood," she continued, relentless, "I am not interested in your internal squabbles. I am interested in the fact that a child and her mother, who were instrumental to our progress, are now suffering for it. This shows a fundamental lack of honor. If you cannot protect the people who help you, how can I trust you to honor a $700 million contract?" The threat was explicit. The contract was no longer just at risk. It was on the verge of being terminated outright. The scandal Richard had predicted was coming true, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't about employing an undocumented immigrant. It was about Arthur's moral failing. Desperate, Arthur looked at Yumi. The girl, realizing the call was with the Japanese delegation, came closer. She took the phone from his hand. "Tanaka-sama," she said, her voice filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. She spoke in Japanese for several minutes. Arthur didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It wasn't pleading. It was explanatory, calm, factual. She wasn't defending Arthur. She was describing the situation, mentioning the word sabotage, and crucially, using terms that evoked the restoration of honor and the fulfilling of obligations. The expression on Mrs. Tanaka's face on the other end of the line, which Arthur could only imagine, must have been softening. Yumi was, once again, building a bridge over the abyss, using her ancestral wisdom to navigate a crisis that no MBA-equipped executive would know how to handle. When she hung up, she looked at Arthur. "She will wait," Yumi said. She said that the true measure of a leader is not the absence of problems, but how he acts to correct them. The statement was an ultimatum, and Inai, at the same time, a lifeline. The next 24 hours were a blur of legal battles and strategic maneuvering. Marcus Thorne, Arthur's lawyer, arrived like a hurricane, armed with injunctions and legal arguments that brought the deportation process to a temporary halt. He secured a postponement, a fragile stay that hinged on a future hearing. The immediate victory gave Arthur breathing room, but he knew it was only the beginning. The story of the incident, however, leaked. Not from Richard's contacts, but from a curious neighbor who saw the immigration vehicles and called a local news channel. The story exploded. The narrative was irresistible. A billionaire, a multi-million-dollar deal with Japan, and the immigrant family at the center of a corporate intrigue. The international media quickly picked up the case, framing it as a scandal of xenophobia and corporate exploitation. Arthur Blackwood's name was being dragged through the mud. His company's stock price began to plummet. Public pressure, a beast Arthur had always managed to keep at bay, was now clawing at his door. He was no longer fighting just for a contract. He was fighting for the survival of his entire legacy. Amid the chaos, Yumi's extraordinary skill became even more apparent. During meetings with the lawyers, she not only translated for her mother, but grasped complex legal nuances, asking questions that left Marcus Thorne impressed. "Where does she get this?" Marcus asked Arthur at one point. After Yumi had questioned a specific clause regarding visas for individuals with extraordinary ability, Arthur, for the first time, asked Emiko directly. The story she told, in her hesitant English, was one of struggle, intelligence, and a deep cultural legacy. Yumi's grandmother, an Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrant in Brazil, had served as an unofficial translator in her community for decades. She helped other families with documents, contracts, and disputes, absorbing the language of law and business out of sheer necessity. She had taught Yumi everything, not in formal lessons, but through stories, conversations, and the daily practice of helping others. Yumi didn't just know the language. She knew specific regional dialects, jargon from different industries, because her grandmother had exposed her to people from all walks of life. Her ability wasn't a magical gift. It was the product of a heritage of service and resilience. This revelation was the second major turning point for Arthur. He had seen Yumi as an anomaly, a child prodigy. He now understood she was the product of a culture and a community, the bearer of a wisdom that could not be bought or taught at any Ivy League school. Meanwhile, the internal investigation at Blackwood Corp, led by a forensic team hired by Arthur, uncovered the third, most treacherous obstacle. Richard Wallace hadn't just been trying to seize power. He had been selling confidential information to a rival Japanese competitor. His campaign to discredit Yumi and sabotage the deal with Miss Tanaka was part of a larger scheme to weaken Blackwood Corp and facilitate a hostile takeover by the competitor. The tip to immigration wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a strategic move to create maximum chaos and devalue the company. The betrayal was deep, a cancer that had spread through his organization. Arthur now faced a war on three fronts: the legal battle to save Emiko and Yumi, the public relations battle to save his reputation, and the corporate battle to save his company from a rival predator. And at the center of it all was Yumi, the girl he had scorned, whose ancestral wisdom was now the key to untangling this complex web of deceit and prejudice. The pressure was immense. The immigration hearing loomed. Ms. Tanaka demanded a public resolution, and the competitor waited in the shadows, ready to make its final move. Arthur Blackwood's empire was on the brink of total collapse. The media firestorm reached its peak. 24-hour news channels ran photos of Arthur alongside images of Yumi, creating a narrative of corporate David versus Goliath. The fourth obstacle, public opinion, was now an uncontrollable force. Immigrant rights groups organized protests outside the Blackwood Corp headquarters. The scandal threatened to taint not just the Japanese contract, but all of the company's business. Partners started expressing concern. The banks holding his debt wanted assurances. The structure of his fortune, once solid as bedrock, now showed alarming fissures. It was at this moment of maximum pressure that the third and most devastating turning point materialized. Ms. Tanaka, through diplomatic channels, issued a formal demand. She no longer wanted private apologies. She wanted a public explanation. She proposed a final meeting to be held in 1 week that would be broadcast live to the international media. In it, Blackwood Corp would have to address the Sato family situation and present the final merits of the contract. If they failed, she would not only cancel the deal, but issue a statement condemning the company's practices, a move that would effectively blacklist them from doing business in Asia. It was checkmate. She was forcing Arthur to confront his scandal on the most public stage imaginable. There would be nowhere to hide. His reputation, his companies, and the futures of Emiko and Yumi would be decided under the unforgiving glare of the world. The deportation, once a legal threat, now seemed imminent. Government lawyers, pressured by the media attention, were inclined to make a swift, decisive ruling to show that no one, not even a billionaire, was above the law. Emiko's hearing was scheduled for the day after Tanaka's proposed broadcast. The family's fate was now inextricably linked to the outcome of that public meeting. Arthur found himself at a moral crossroads. He could try to manage the damage, present a sanitized corporate version of events, blame everything on Richard and try to salvage what was left of his image. Or he could do the one thing that honor demanded, the thing that Yumi, with her quiet wisdom, had taught him to value: the truth. He spent the next few days not with his PR team, but with Emiko and Yumi. He listened to Emiko's full story, her journey from Japan to Brazil with her parents, and then to the United States for a better life for her daughter after her husband's death. He heard about her struggles with bureaucracy, the hardships of being a single mother in a foreign country, the dream of giving Yumi the opportunities she never had. For the first time, Arthur saw Emiko not as the cleaner, but as a woman of extraordinary strength and resilience. He saw the love and intelligence that had shaped Yumi. His internal conflict peaked. To save his empire, he had to shed the arrogance that had defined him his entire life. He needed to admit his failure, his blindness, his prejudice. He needed to put himself in a position of total public vulnerability. The night before the televised meeting, he stood in his office, looking out at the city he had always considered his domain. But he saw the lights differently now. Every light was a story, a struggle, a family like Emiko and Yumi's. His world had expanded beyond profit and loss statements. He picked up the phone and called Claire. "Cancel the script from the PR team. I'll be writing what I have to say myself." He knew that what he did tomorrow could either destroy him completely or somehow begin to rebuild not just his company, but his very soul. The hall was cold, an air-conditioned oasis against the heat of the 5th week of this ordeal. The television lights were hot and blinding, turning the audience of journalists, executives, and government officials into a mass of faceless silhouettes. At the center of the stage, a long table. On one side, Ms. Tanaka and her delegation, as impassive as jade statues. On the other, a single empty chair next to Arthur. And in the middle, on a slightly lower chair, sat Yumi. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, and regarded the crowd with a composure that shamed the adults around her. Beside her, in a front-row seat, sat Emiko, hands clasped in her lap, her face a mixture of terror and fierce pride. This was the climax, the moment of highest tension. The futures of everyone in that room somehow depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Arthur's career, the $700 million contract, a family's fate, the reputation of 2 trading nations, it all hung in the balance. The moderator, a famous journalist, began the broadcast. The cameras zoomed in on Arthur. The world expected a corporate defense, a polished excuse, an attack on the disloyal former employee. Arthur stepped to the microphone, the papers he'd prepared in his hand. He glanced at them, then at Yumi, and set them aside. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "I am here today not to defend my actions, but to own them. For weeks, my company has been at the center of a controversy, and the truth is, the fault is mine." A murmur went through the crowd. "I am a man who built an empire on numbers. I saw people as assets or liabilities. I saw status, not worth. And because of that blindness, I nearly destroyed everything that matters." He turned to Emiko. "I employed Miss Emiko Sato, but I never saw her. I saw only a uniform. I didn't know her strength, her story, her dignity." He then turned to Yumi. "And I saw her daughter, Yumi, as an inconvenience, a child out of place. I did not see the heir to a profound wisdom, a brilliant communicator, a courageous soul." He paused, swallowing hard. The crisis my company faces was not caused by an immigration issue or a treacherous employee. It was caused by my own prejudice. I humiliated and dismissed the very people who held the key to our success. And when faced with a threat, my first instinct was to protect my net worth, even if it meant sacrificing an innocent family. For that, I ask for forgiveness. He bowed, not a Western nod, but a deep, formal Japanese bow in the direction of Emiko and Yumi. The flash of the cameras was deafening. The gesture, broadcast live to Tokyo, was an act of such profound humility it stunned everyone. Mrs. Tanaka, for the first time, allowed an expression of surprise to cross her face, but the ordeal wasn't over. The moderator turned to Yumi. "Miss Sato, there have been allegations that your translations were inaccurate, and that your age makes you incapable of handling such complex negotiations. What do you have to say?" Her family's future hung on her answer. Yumi adjusted herself in her chair, leaning toward the microphone. She did not look like an 8-year-old girl. She looked like a queen. "Words," she began in clear, unaccented English, "are like bridges. They can connect two sides, or they can crumble. Accuracy isn't just about translating one word for another. It is about translating respect, intention, and heart." She then turned to Mrs. Tanaka and began speaking in flawless, formal Japanese, explaining one of the contract's most complex technical concepts with a clarity and elegance that made the members of the Japanese delegation lean forward, mesmerized. It was the final demonstration, the moment of truth. Yumi's demonstration was irrefutable. She did not just translate, she elucidated, weaving culture, business, and language into a tapestry of mutual understanding. When she finished, a stunned silence hung over the hall. No one dared to clap, but the admiration was palpable. Miss Tanaka rose slowly. All eyes turned to her. She walked to the center of the stage, took a microphone, and addressed the crowd. Speaking in English for the first time in public, her voice was resonant and full of authority. For weeks, the world has debated the risks of this contract, but today, we have seen its true value. It is not in the $700 million, it is in the lesson that Mr. Blackwood and, more importantly, young Yumi-san have taught us. She turned to Arthur. "Mr. Blackwood, your public confession today showed a courage that many leaders lack. You lost a vice president, but you have gained honor." Next, she turned to Yumi, and her face softened. "Yumi-san, you have reminded us that wisdom has no age, and talent knows no borders. Your grandmother gave you a treasure, and you have shared it with the world." Then, she made the announcement everyone was waiting for. The Tanaka Corporation is proud to announce that we will not only be moving forward with our partnership with the Blackwood Corporation, but we will be expanding it. Together, we will create a foundation to support the education of talented immigrant children, ensuring that other Yumis are given the opportunity to shine. The room erupted in applause. The contract was not just saved, it was strengthened, transformed from a mere financial agreement into a partnership built on shared values. The resolution of the conflicts began to unfold rapidly. Arthur's public confession, combined with the evidence from the investigation into Richard Wallace's treason, led to legal action against the former executive and the rival company. Blackwood Corp not only fended off a hostile takeover, but emerged from the crisis with a renewed reputation for integrity. Arthur's first victory, getting the deportation delayed, was transformed into a permanent one. With the full legal backing of his company and the public spotlight on the case, Emiko's status was resolved. She was granted not just citizenship, but a formal apology from the immigration department for her ordeal. Arthur's humiliation at revealing his dependence on a child had become his greatest strength. The world no longer saw him as weak, but as a leader who had learned from his mistakes. The second victory, the official signing of the $700 million deal, took place the following week in a ceremony far different from the tense initial meeting. It was a celebration. Yumi was there, not as a hidden translator, but as the guest of honor. During the ceremony, she gave a short presentation on the importance of cross-cultural communication in business, a presentation that received a standing ovation. The final victory, however, was the most profound. It was Arthur's moral transformation. He made good on his promise. Emiko Sato, the cleaner he barely noticed, was promoted to a newly created position, Director of International and Cultural Relations. Her life experience and deep understanding of multiple cultures were, as Arthur admitted to his board, a more valuable asset than any university degree. He established the Promised Program, a scholarship and mentorship fund for young immigrants, financed with a significant portion of his own net worth. The company that was once a monument to his arrogance was becoming a model of inclusion and diversity. The narrative arcs were closing, not with unrealistic happy endings, but with hard-won resolutions that acknowledged the pain of the past while building a hopeful future. The crisis had forced everyone to confront their prejudices, and in the process, they had discovered a stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more human way of doing business. 5 weeks had passed since that day of panic and desperation, 5 weeks that felt like a lifetime. Arthur Blackwood's office was the same physical space, with the same glass walls, offering the same stunning view of the city, but the atmosphere was unrecognizable. The air, once thin and tense, now seemed to vibrate with a new energy, a mixture of optimism and purpose. Where there had once been austere silence, there was now the soft sound of different languages being spoken in the hallways, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, by the new talent the inclusion program had brought in. Arrogance had given way to gratitude, contempt for cultural difference, to a celebration of diversity. The transformation was complete. Arthur was in a new conference room, smaller and more collaborative. He watched as a new international meeting unfolded, this time with a German conglomerate. Beside him, Emiko Sato, in an elegant business suit, offered cultural insights that had already averted several minor misunderstandings. And at the head of the table, guiding the communication with a confidence and grace that seemed entirely natural, was Yumi. She was no longer a secret presence or an emergency solution. With the blessing of Ms. Tanaka, who had become a mentor to the girl, Yumi now served as a junior cultural consultant for the company, a specially created position with a flexible schedule that fit around her schoolwork. She was not there to translate word for word, but to build bridges of understanding, a role she performed with a mastery that continued to astound everyone. Arthur looked at her, not with the desperate dependence of before, but with a deep and sincere respect. The girl who was nearly deported for saving a $700 million deal had taught him the most valuable lesson of his life, that a company's greatest asset is not in its balance sheet or its cash flow, but in the human potential it is capable of recognizing and nurturing. He learned that true wealth was not measured in dollars, euros, or Bitcoin, but in the strength of human connection. The partnership with the Tanaka Corporation flourished, becoming the most profitable and meaningful business relationship in the history of Blackwood Corp. Ms. Tanaka was no longer just a client, she was an ally, bound to Arthur by a mutual respect forged in crisis. Arthur's empire had not just survived, it had evolved. His net worth was recovering and growing more sustainably, for it was now built on a foundation of integrity and cultural innovation. The story ended as it began, in a conference room with a high-stakes deal on the line, but this time there was no panic, no arrogance, no fear. There was only trust, collaboration, and the quiet wisdom of an 8-year-old girl who proved that the most unlikely saviors can teach us the most important lessons. True competence knows no age, origin, or social status, and sometimes, to build the future, you must have the courage to own the mistakes of the past and the humility to accept help from the most unexpected source.